Welcome to our first virtual fundraiser and documentary event. My name is Lisa DOCKEN and I'm Executive Director of the Copper River Watershed Project. And thank you very much for joining us. With many of us being unable to connect with the places that we love this year, I hope that this film helps to bring the Copper River Watershed right into your home, ignites excitement and joy about a place that we really love, and reminds us of how rare our intact watershed has become. Across such a vast landscape and diverse communities, we at the Copper River Watershed Project are your professional conveners and facilitators. Watershed scale planning and projects means no one organization can do it alone. Our nonprofit partners with state, federal, and tribal entities to bring together resources and expertise to make positive change. Whether we gather people, organize construction projects, or large-scale cleanups, we find creative and innovative ways to continue to support the watershed, its people, and its economies. During our live event, if you're logged into YouTube, please reach out to us and type in the chat box. We have an ongoing silent auction, and that will be closing 1 hour after this event has completed. And consider donating to our Give Lively campaign. Some of our silent auction items are here. This is a hand-woven scarf that's dyed with mushrooms from the Cordova area, and it's really beautiful, hand-woven. We have a hand carving by duckboy decoys. This is a dunlin, a common species that migrates through the Copper River Delta. And then original hand-painted leaf here framed by Dottie Woodman. So please check them out on the website at copperriver.org. And with no further ado, I welcome you to the beginning of our first virtual Wild Watershed fundraising documentary. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce Nick MERLINO. He's our board chair and would like to present this year's Watershed Hero Award for 2020.
Every year, Copper River Watershed Project asks for nominations from our communities across the basin and in Cordova for an individual in our watershed that exemplifies the positive things and the ingenuity that comes with living in a place like this. This year we received many nominations, including multiple nominations for an individual from McCarthy, Alaska. Jason Essler, who lived here in McCarthy, formed our first trash business here. He's responsible for recycling thousands of pounds of tin and aluminum and plastic out of our valley here. He had a homestead service where he helped people fire-wise around their houses. He helped them clear for their homesteads, and he also helped collect firewood, and among multiple other business endeavors that he pursued. Unfortunately, Jason passed away this last fall, and so this year we wanted to recognize him with a certificate for his family as our watershed hero for his service to his community and his watershed, and to match $500 in donations for our Katsina River cleanup effort, where we'll be removing RVs and trash from the Katsina River Delta in his honor. Thank you, Jason.
So I came to the country, I came to Alaska in the Air Force in 1976. And in 1977, a friend approached me at work and said, "Hey, do you want to go dip netting?" I'm like, "Well, what's dip netting?" He goes, "Oh, you go to this river with this net on a long-handled pole and you stick it in the water and you pull fish out. I'm like, well, where do you do that? He goes, Chitna. I'm like, well, where the hell is Chitna? And I said, yeah, I'll try it, you know. So 3 of us with 1 net drove from Anchorage to Chitna and hiked down the Copper River from O'Brien Creek, 3.5 miles into the canyon, found a spot to dip, and we took turns with the net. And when it was their turn, they kept pulling out reds, and I kept getting nothing, you know, and I was like sorely disappointed. But towards the end of the day, it was my turn with the net, and I stuck the net in, and I pulled out a 35-pound king salmon, white meat king salmon, like this. And it just made my day. It was a beautiful sunny day in July, and I caught a fish that would feed everybody in my Air Force squadron. And I was a cook in the Air Force, so having a fish to take home that would feed everybody that lived in my building at once was just this grand treat. And I sat there looking across the river out the Chitna Valley going, wow, a person could catch fish and live off of it and live over there. That's what I want to do. And it took me 10 years from catching that king salmon south of O'Brien Creek in Woods Canyon to putting a roof on this building and moving here permanently.
Fish brought me to Cordova. I'm a fish biologist by, through education, and I was working back in New York State with the transplanted salmon that they have there, basically Pacific salmon that they brought over and popped into Lake Ontario. And that kind of got me involved with doing research on salmon. And the next logical step for me to take was get over to the West Coast where we have wild salmon, and there's no better place for that than Alaska. And I was lucky enough to get a job here in Cordova, and came up here for about 3 months, and it just stuck with me. I've been here ever since.
Kenny Lake was established as a farming community about in the 1950s. There had been a roadhouse and kind of a trail going through, but that's when Kenny Lake became established. And this is really where I fell in love with the Copper River Valley. When I was a kid, I remember driving to Chitna, and you'd come down the hill, it's on the other road, you'd come down the hill and boom, all of a sudden there were mountains and there were farms, and you'd go, oh, wow, this is an amazing place.
We knew when we got married that we wanted to raise our family here in GAKONA because it was such an awesome place for him to grow up, and we just knew that was the lifestyle we wanted for our kids.
My name is Eric Lutz, the owner of the GLENNALLEN Rustic B&B Resort in Glennallen, Alaska, in the heart of the Copper Basin. I used to work for the National Park Service. I've also been in the Watershed area, the Copper Basin area, for about 22 years now. I came up here working for Wrangell St. Elias National Park, the largest park in the National Park Service system. I enjoyed this area. I came up here. Why did I stick here? It's really confusing to me sometimes. I wonder that actually, how it all came about or why it came about. But I think one of my favorite things about this place is the lack of traffic lights. And that sounds kind of, very put a pinpoint on something, but I realize that I don't spend my time in traffic.
The thing that I love about up here is the wildlife, the beautiful, beautiful scenery. And I never ever get tired of the wildlife. I still stop and look at moose and anything that I see alongside the road because it is just amazingly beautiful.
mean, our clients with hunting, they spend a lot of time traveling the world, so they see a lot of beautiful places for sure. But one thing that came up a lot this year, especially because up there, so I go up and I cook. My sister-in-law and I cook, and we're the camp cooks, and we both have all our kids there. And they see the life our kids get to experience, and it's pretty unique. And that was more so was the comment of, wow, your kids, that this is amazing that they get to grow up like this. And I think that's becoming more and more rare, you know, unless you're intentional about it.
One thing I think when people come out here, one thing they really notice is how wild it is, right? This is about as wild as you can get, I think, in America without leaving the road system. You know, you can drive here to McCarthy, which is different than a lot of Alaska, right? But accessing here is fairly remote. And just the pristine nature of where we're living, and the wildness of it. Really, I think it's hard to define, but that's kind of a word that fits it, is just how wild it is still.
I mean, to me, when I think about my favorite place in the world, it's gonna be the journey between 36 Mile on the Copper River Highway, which is as far as we can go now from Cordova. The journey from there up to our camps, and you know, that it's basically you know, me solo in a boating up the river for a few hours, and you know, the lower river, it's all very braided. You're basically following channels, and on the outside edges of those channels, there's just miles of log jams, and you know, that river changes pretty regularly, so you're always reading the river. But as you progress further upriver, you get closer to Miles Lake, and you're literally boating on a river right along Childs Glacier. So you just have this epic glacier on one side of you, and a nice riverbank on the other side, and you're just boating up, hoping the thing doesn't calve as you're boating past. But it's pretty amazing, you know, to see an area where you have a river that varies from, you know, 40,000 CFS to 400,000 CFS within a single season. That's cubic feet per second. To have a river that's that dynamic, just crashing into a glacier and doing a dog leg and coming around and causing that glacier to calve. I mean, that's a really cool thing to be a part of and see. And then as you progress past that, the river just opens up to this epic lake, and Miles Lake. And it's like a lake in the middle of the river, right? So very, very still water, you know, super wide, you know, 8 miles wide. And on the other end is Miles Glacier. So, you know, you have the river that just moves between these two gigantic glaciers. And, you know, you're boating around icebergs that are the size of houses, and this is just like a daily commute.
It's an intact watershed, and that's unique. You know, a lot of places when we talk about watersheds, we'll talk about, say, the Columbia River watershed, and they've got giant dams, and it's running through cities, it's been channelized, there's industrial pollution, both new and old. You have all these problems, and here we have this watershed that really it functions as a whole. There's no major gaps in our ecosystems.
We have a chance to keep a watershed intact. I think a lot of what we've seen around the world as early civilizations developed, rivers were the place for commerce and transportation, and so they became heavily impacted as communities grew up around them and the industrial practices increased. And here we have one of the largest intact wetlands in North America at the mouth. There's no channelization as this river meets the ocean. We have no major mining or development threats up in our headwaters. There's no dams, there's no irrigation. And we still have communities that can subsist on the resources that they can hunt and harvest here.
We have wild natural salmon populations here that have been untouched, you know, for the last 7,000 years, just naturally evolving in this habitat. You know, we don't depend on giant hatcheries to mitigate and offset, you know, habitat destruction or you know, mortality associated with dams and whatnot. We don't have that here. We have a perfect ecosystem in a watershed that's just fairly pristine. And I think that's something that needs to be valued and recognized. And I think everyone here in the watershed does realize that, and I think most people do cherish that. But we need the world to recognize how important that is.
When we do youth programs, and that's one of the biggest things we do together, one of the things we teach the youth is the saying, we all live downstream. And we really challenge the youth to really embrace that idea and understand it. And so what we all live downstream means, you know, like literally it means that if I pollute the watershed here and you live downstream, that you're going to see the impacts. But especially because we've got the salmon coming up and down the river, we do all live downstream. And so something that happens down in the Copper River Delta, it could affect us really profoundly up here. We're connected with that river. And it's hard sometimes to realize how connected we are because of the disconnect in traveling, because of the really, really different cultures. We have two different native cultures. Because of the different ecosystems. There are temperate rainforests down there. We're a boreal forest. You know, we get 50 below. There, it's a super cold day if they get, you know, 20 above, 10 above. And so we're super, super different. And I think that means you need to work harder to find the commonalities. And the commonality, the big one, is salmon. Bar none, you know, everyone here loves salmon. And if you start talking about salmon, you can get everyone on the same page pretty quickly.
It's a group that looks at the dynamics of a geographic area that is all one drainage and works to protect the resources that keep the water in a pristine quality. And to keep the water in a pristine quality, you have to protect some of the landscape in various ways. And so when the Watershed project started, I was keen to, you know, join in because it's the ideal way for man to live on the landscape, is to keep in mind that all the people that live here are in a common resource zone, and the water is what connects us all, and the fish that swim in the water connects us all the way to the coast. And so the Watershed project, from the start, you know, they reached out to engage people upriver. You know, their headquarters in Cordova, but they reached out early on, and you know, I joined in because I find it a valuable way of metering how I look at the world.
Well, one of the really basic tenets of the Copper River Watershed Project that it was founded on is that it's a watershed-wide organization, that any conversation that we have, any decisions that we try to make, if we don't include and consider the entire watershed, we're kind of setting ourselves up for failure. So I think it's really, really important for the two ends of the watershed to talk to each other and to understand their differences and their commonalities. And it's weird because, as you know, like, even though we're connected by the river, you know, it's like 90 miles by river to get to Cordova, but it's a long ways around on the ferry or the plane and the highway, and you make a big loop in the wrong direction. And so people forget that we're connected. You know, there's a lot of people here who've never been to Cordova and vice versa. And so the Watershed Project is really working hard to bring that holistic way of thinking. Instead of I'm from Kenny Lake, to feel like I'm from the whole Copper River Watershed Project or Copper River Watershed. I know that it's good for this area. You know, it's a bridge building organization for this area. It brings people together. They are really, really good at bringing people who think that they're not on the same side around a table and making them realize that deep down that we all believe in the same things.
The way that the Watershed Project will coordinate with multiple agencies and groups and try to work all those towards a common goal is amazing to me. Because you can have one person working on a piece of it and one person working on a piece of it, but until you get that cohesive action, that's where you see the big, the big things happen. And I think they do an excellent job of making that happen.
It's a huge watershed. I mean, we're talking, 67,000 square kilometers. So there's a lot to do, and it's way more than any one single organization can handle. It's something that you need partnerships with people like the Copper River Watershed Project, the Native Village of EAC, National Park Service, Alaska Department of Fish and Game, ATREC. You have to have these partnerships between the different organizations in the watershed to maximize the potential for the work that you can get done.
So the Watershed Project, over our history, has worked building partnerships across the landscape. So there's not any one land manager that's responsible for managing all of the land. We're here on National Forest land. Up in the interior, there's a large chunk of land that's National Park Service. There's BLM lands. There's private lands, Native Corporation lands, state lands. And so each entity might have roads on their lands that they're responsible for. They might have management practices that they're doing on their particular land. And we've been working to connect with these landowners and land managers and identify common issues that we can work together to address.
The cool thing about the Watershed Project is they take that science and then they actually apply it to the projects that are going on. So they learn about what's, from the scientists, they're learning about what affects salmon, and then they create projects to go do it. So the Culvert Project is a direct example of understanding the science and then going out and doing something about it.
It was probably upwards of 12, 13 years ago now, there were some meetings up in the Copper Basin that identified that culverts were a big issue. So in our watershed, there are a few hundred culverts, even though we don't have that many people or that many miles of road compared to other parts of the country. But the state had done a study of the culverts and come to the conclusion that 64% were inadequate for fish passage, 32% needed more information, and about 4% were actually good for passing fish. But what that didn't tell us was which ones were associated with the best fish habitats.
I think one of the most right now applicable important things the watershed does is their culvert restoration. I think that's huge. And honestly, it's something that I wasn't even aware we did until I got on the board, and I was like, wow, people need to know this because that's super important.
So we're here at 25 Mile in the Copper River Delta. It gets its name because we're 25 miles outside of downtown Cordova. We've crossed the Copper River Delta to get here, and along the way have crossed over many culverts. This is what I'm sitting on, is a newly installed fish-friendly culvert. It's called a stream simulation design. And the reason that we work to install these is because we want fish that are moving through our watershed to not realize when they're crossing under a roadway. Culverts that have been installed in the past tend to be smaller, and they're less costly when they're smaller, and so there's an advantage to making them of the smaller size. But the smaller pipes can constrict the stream. They can increase the velocity of the water. It can cause up and downstream scouring and changes the morphology of our streams. So by installing these much larger culverts, we can simulate what the stream is doing outside the influence of the road, underneath the road, through the larger culverts.
The work the Watershed Project has done in identifying where salmon spawn, where rearing habitat is, and what it takes to protect that lowest thing on the totem pole, because most of us all the time don't think about what's happening with the little baby salmon. But if you build a road with a creek going under it and you put a culvert in that fish can't get through, then all of a sudden you've cut off everything upstream as fish habitat. And that was one of the things that the Watershed project focused on early on. And even though they don't have the resources to attack it all, they started one project at a time. And they've slowly worked towards eradicating all the hung culverts in the Copper Basin and expanded the ability for salmon to go into all their natal habitat to raise, to keep the salmon going.
When I started with the organization is when we were just picking up, putting together a protocol for scoring these crossings. And so we would take measurements of the stream and measurements of the existing culvert and then develop a score for its ability to pass fish, as well as the quality of the habitat associated with the crossing. And then from there, we were able to come up with a rough ranking of which were the highest priority crossings on the highest priority streams for restoration. Because restoration can be a little bit costly. This culvert was over $100,000, just this one, and there were 2 more that we installed as part of this project. So we needed to know where was the best place to direct our restoration dollars. So these crossings that we're visiting today in particular were a result of this region-wide partnership that we had that had developed a score for culverts and had identified on the Copper River Highway the culverts that were the highest priority for replacing. And then we convened with partners including the Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, Alaska Department of Fish and Game, the U.S. Forest Service, and then Department of Transportation to select a subset of culverts on the highway, looking at the highest scoring ones that were a priority for us. So we submitted a funding request to the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trustee Council, and we're very pleased to receive just over $8 million to be replacing a total of 11 culverts on the Delta and removing 2 more that will just be, there's no need to keep an open road over top of them. One of them happens to be in the woods and the other is a side road that will just be a low water ford. So we're very excited about it because it's actually restoration at the scale of a watershed within the watershed. So the culvert that I'm sitting on, as well as there's one to my left and one to my right, that were all part of the same restoration effort and are all part of the 25-mile system. And so instead of just having to pick the one on the 25-mile system that could use the most work, we were able to replace all 3 of them this summer. Same thing next summer, we're working at 18-mile system, which is another big coho, as well as a cutthroat trout system here on the Delta, and we'll be replacing 3 culverts within that system. So again, I'm not having to pick our favorite within 18-mile, but getting to do all 3 of them is true watershed restoration at its best. And so this culvert, the way that they're designed is, the goal is to try to make it wide to simulate the stream going through it. And what's hard to imagine is that this culvert is 20+ feet wide, but it's also almost 17 feet deep. And so it allows the contractor to actually use equipment to be able to move the stream material into the pipe and make the bottom look like the stream bottom before and after the road crossing. And so it requires quite a large pipe to be able to build that kind of substrate and stream bottom inside it. And then for the system out here, based on the reference reaches of the stream we were using to design it, this was the width that our engineers were determining would be the best, because we not only want to accommodate fish, but increasing the size of your culvert can help protect your road infrastructure. And so as we are seeing increases in an already rainy climate and seeing increases in precipitation and potential peak flow from glacial melt, we want to make sure that we're designing these for a 100-year event, and those 100-year events are changing in their size, and so being large enough to handle that flow of water is definitely part of the long-term plan for the design as well.
people should support the watershed simply because it's a vital food source for the entire country, actually. I mean, Copper River salmon are valued all around the world. I mean, everybody knows about Copper Valley salmon. They're just amazingly good. And I don't know, it's something about the oils in them or something that make them a little bit better, I guess you'd say, or valued than a lot of the other sources of salmon. And so it's vitally important to keep this watershed clean and pure so that we can continue to have that.
People come here and they are just blown away by the openness, the size, the grandeur, but also the, I don't think people even think or believe that there's places like this anymore. You see it on TV, but you figure, you know, TV's not really real. You've documented it somehow or something like that, and they see it firsthand and they grasp the scope of how big it is and how impressive it is. You're not going to get that in too many other places. I mean, outside of Alaska. And I think that's what makes me stick here. That's one of the things that makes me want to be a part of this, because it is the, not to quote a license plate, but the last frontier. And it's through that preservation of some place like this that people will have this opportunity.
So in order to make these projects happen and get to the place where we can be requesting funding like the scale that we received from the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trustee Council for this particular project, there's a lot of time spent building relationships, building trust, getting on the ground data to be able to develop, have the data we need to do the design, whether it's collecting hydrology data or assessing fish populations. And all of that is made possible because as a nonprofit we have a broad membership support, and individual contributors might not feel like they're giving a lot with their individual donation, but those all add up and support the time that we need to be able to build those relationships and make those connections and get to the point where we are today with being able to have a solid proposal to take to funders that is fundable and that they're excited to invest in making a reality. So definitely couldn't do it were it not for our membership support.
One of the first things I did as a board member was writing little notes on thank you letters to some of our contributing members who've gone above and beyond. And I noticed that one of the members that I was helping write to was from Ohio. And that's where I grew up. They lived about 45 minutes away from where I grew up in Ohio. And I kind of scratched my head thinking, why would somebody from Ohio be so interested in what's going on all the way up here? And I think that shows how important this place is to people who maybe even just visit, that there are a lot of people that the watershed in our region of Alaska, it really speaks to them, whether they're here for tourism reasons, visiting family, or as scientists.
So I think for somebody who might not live here or might not benefit from getting to recreate and enjoy this amazing Copper River Delta, I think that there's still a significant value to helping to invest in keeping a watershed like the Copper River region intact. For one, if anyone likes to enjoy Copper River salmon, it takes this intact, healthy watershed to produce the salmon, to keep salmon going to market, to be able to be enjoyed around the world. And also, I mentioned earlier how there's not many river systems that are this intact and undisturbed. And so to be able to have a region, especially in the Pacific rim of rivers around the Pacific Ocean, to have a watershed like the Copper River continue to produce salmon, it can serve as an example or a reference for restoration in other parts of more disturbed areas, and also can help produce fish that have a natural tendency to migrate, and some of them might find new places to live, and so in some of these more damaged areas, having healthy salmon in nearby river systems could be an advantage to helping keep Pacific salmon alive and well in other watersheds as well. It's not like the whole population is going to look to recolonize, but there's a natural straying that happens within salmon anyway, and so being able to keep this watershed healthy is only going to benefit neighboring watersheds as well.
I'm Ken Hodges, and I'm a longtime supporter of the Copper River Watershed Project. I'd like to think that we could help maintain this ecosystem as it is now. By maintaining the habitats, we can keep the commercial fisheries going, as well as the sport and subsistence fisheries. I've been out hunting today, and there's certainly all these wetlands support a number of waterfowl, ducks, geese, and other things that are good for subsistence lifestyles.
Thank you so much for being with us here today as we celebrate our connection to the watershed, to its communities, and to each other. We need your help for our continued boots on the ground efforts in support of our watershed. Please visit our silent auction that will continue until 5 p.m. Alaska time, and consider becoming a member and donating at our Give Lively campaign. The links for these two will be in the description below. Funds raised for this campaign will help to continue our support of the watershed in many ways, such as the Fish Passage like you saw here today, but we have numerous other programs that we support, including recycling, invasive plant management, and youth education. Any contribution you can give is significant, and every little bit helps. As you know, we are a nonprofit that convenes and brings together resources, and becoming a member means you are helping us too. And with that, have a wonderful evening, and thank you so much.